frente al mar desde Puerto Rico. La equidad de género va logrando escaños en la política desde Ecuador, por una arquitectura al servicio del ser humano desde Brasil. Son relatos del mundo que no caben en un tuit.
No son tweets, son historias. Viernes, solo por Telesur.
In 2007, in the midst of Chevron fighting the indigenous victims of their oil pollution, a new government came into power. It was one that openly declared Chevron's actions a crime against people and nature, blasphemy to the reign of corporate rule. Chevron declared this government corrupt, and all of its court rulings against them illegitimate. While in Ecuador's capital of Quito, I asked their Minister of Foreign Affairs, Guillaume Long, about this charge. Minister Long is a French-born academic who became involved in Ecuadorian politics during their progressive upsurge. Chevron's response, of course, is that Ecuador is corrupt.
Well, coming from one of the most corrupt transnational corporations in the world, we have a saying in Spanish, el burro hablando de orejas, the donkey speaking of its own ears. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's cynicism in its most crude form. Chevron is an extremely corrupt entity. It has strived all these years to get its way through its financial power. And it's very interesting that when Ecuador was a very weak state with quite a lot of corruption, and it insisted adamantly that all its issues within Ecuador should be solved in Ecuador. Why? Because it was easier to corrupt officials. And it played a very nefarious role in the old Ecuador and in corrupting the judicial system in order to have its way. When this government comes to power, suddenly it senses that there are clear rules of the game, that there are regulations, that there's a state asserting itself, and it starts arguing for moving away from the Ecuadorian judicial system and taking it back to the United States, when in fact for decades it had argued the exact reverse, that everything should be sorted in Ecuador and nobody should poke their nose into the matter. You know, this is an Ecuadorian issue. But as soon as we came to power, the argument was the exact reverse.
Chevron is hedging its billions on the argument that Ecuador's government is now corrupt, and their crimes are absolved by deals with past governments they considered not corrupt. Of course, Chevron is assuming that the real history of the country will not be told. The land within Ecuador's borders today has over 8,000 years of history, where indigenous groups cooperatively networked their sovereign tribes across the region. All of this changed in 1463, when the Inca Empire sought to conquer their land, which was fiercely resisted by Ecuador's tribes for almost 4 decades, until they were defeated. Rule by the Inca continued until the arrival of the Spanish Empire in 1531, which quickly and violently took control. The next 300 years would be scarred by the iron fist of Spanish colonial rule. But in the early 19th century, independence leaders Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín were leading mass armies to liberate South America from the ruthless shackles of the Spanish crown. Their movement emboldened the oppressed across the continent, including in Ecuador. Insurgent actions by Ecuadorian fighters drove out the Spanish troops. They declared independence in 1820, but politics continued to be dominated by rich elites. The rubber boom of 1879 ushered in decades of unprecedented horror for Ecuador and its neighbors, where rubber barons ravaged the Amazon for US, UK, and French companies. They used the brutal enslavement of indigenous Amazonians from Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia to steal the vast, highly profitable raw material. In some areas, a shocking 90% of Indian populations were wiped out. One anthropologist writes of this period, The horrendous atrocities that were unleashed on the Indian people of the Amazon during the height of the rubber boom were like nothing that had been seen since the first days of the Spanish conquest. During the so-called second rubber boom in the early 1940s, U.S. companies needed new migrant workers. So they created the Rubber Development Corporation, which bribed governments of the Amazon basin with $100 for every worker they shipped to mine rubber. Thousands were forced into indentured servitude as a result. Around 30,000 rubber workers died in the corporation's rush for profits. But outside the Amazon, a political struggle was being waged in Ecuadorian society. Still the monocrop economy they had been forced into by the Spanish, Ecuador became split into two centers of power: the wealthy landowners of the cocoa and banana fields, and the big port and factory owners who got rich off exporting those products. The indigenous people, peasants, and working class in Ecuador were marginalized, while these two competing bourgeoisies duked it out for supremacy. There was major social inequality, and the political system was considered completely corrupt, so there were strikes all over the country. The biggest was a general strike in 1922 in the city of Guayaquil by workers protesting for fair wages from their employers. During a mass march nearing the end of the strike, the military started shooting randomly into the peaceful demonstration. Upper-class residents of the neighborhood also came out onto their balconies and joined the soldiers in shooting into the crowd. The slaughter is estimated to have killed around 1,000 innocent people. Hundreds of bodies were thrown in the river. The massacre dealt a major blow to the workers' movement, sending leaders into jail and exile. Discontent over stark inequality caused the populism of Velasco Ibarra to gain prominence. As a shining example of how tumultuous Ecuadorian politics was over the years, Ibarra would win 5 presidential elections, but in 4 of those terms was deposed by a military coup. Another upsurge in Ecuadorian society came in 1944 when again, under another dictator, indigenous peoples, farm workers, students, and more rose up in protest all over the country. Insurrectionist soldiers arrested the repressive police forces and burned down their army barracks. Ibarra came to power again in this revolt. While his own dictatorial policies quickly earned the ire of those who brought him to power, he also made enemies with the U.S. empire for not being a total puppet for its interests. He was overthrown in 1961 in a U.S.-backed coup. The U.S. employed more than just regime change to control the country. According to CIA agent Philip Agee, almost every single political organization in the country was infiltrated, with over 200 senior officials in Ecuador's government working as CIA assets. Politicians would give CIA-written speeches, and newspapers would run CIA-written stories. Operatives even bombed churches and framed leftists to fuel anti-communist propaganda. Ibarra's successor, his vice president, Carlos Julio Arrozmana, was also overthrown in a CIA coup in 1963. A new U.S. puppet junta took power, suspended democratic elections, declared it illegal to be a communist, and started rounding up progressives. It is this puppet government that invited Texaco to do as it pleased in the Amazon, where it dug over 1,000 oil pits in the pristine jungle.
Well, there's a long history of Ecuador playing a subordinate role in the international system, going back to colonial and post-colonial times. Ecuador, for many decades, played a very peripheral role in the international system through the production of raw materials, a plantation economy, importing throughout the 20th century manufactured goods from industrial powers, and basically inserting itself in the international economy through bananas, then later on seafood, but before that 19th century cocoa, of course, so according different periods in history, inserting itself with different products, but always raw materials. And then oil came along in the 1960s and 70s, and it was at the time seen as it would save the Ecuadorian economy, it would make Ecuador and Ecuadorians prosperous, but of course it was a new raw material, and in fact many mistakes were made, including letting all these transnational corporations come in without any rules, without any regulations, without any precedent, without any institutions or institutionality, and reaping meager benefits from multinational companies that used to do pretty much what they wanted in a very corrupt context with very weak a very weak state.
A corrupt state and control by the U.S. fueled the movement for progressive change. In 1979, Jaime Roldos became president on a popular platform of opposing U.S. policy and doubling the minimum wage. The Roldos presidency coincided with a new assault by the U.S. empire on leftists across Latin America, known as Operation Condor, where U.S.-backed death squads along with state forces killed an estimated 60,000 people. The mysterious death of President Roldos in 1981 is believed to be one of Operation Condor's many, many political assassinations. Ecuador's entire modern history is one dominated by outside empires, aided by its own corrupt elites. The legacy of underdevelopment, coupled with the ravages of neoliberalism, set the country deeper into unrest. In the late 90s, Ecuador entered into its worst economic crisis ever. Millions fled the country to find jobs. 16 banks collapsed, and the currency became taken over by the US dollar. It was under this major crisis that the Ecuadorian government signed off on a remediation process that was nothing more than a quid pro quo between Texaco and elite officials in the country. In 1998, the highly unpopular neoliberal president Jamil Mouhad gave Chevron the ultimate gift, called the Act of Liberation. This document declared that no one, private or public, could sue Texaco for the damage for all of its dirty operations, past, present, and future.
I think 10, 15 years ago, Ecuador was too precarious, the Ecuadorian state was too weak, I would say even too corrupt, too elite-driven in order to be able to face, in a sovereign manner, this challenge posed by Chevron. We were completely permeated by foreign domination. We even had a US military base in Manta. All sorts of aspects of sovereignty. When you have strong men, or in academia, warlords, but in this case they weren't at war, but kind of caudillos in Latin American culture, mayors that are stronger than presidents. Let's not forget that in a decade prior to our government, we had 7 presidents in 10 years. I mean, this really illustrates really well the kind of institutional weakness, a kind of failed state. We use the expression failed state in hyper-violent contexts. We think of certain countries which I will not name now, but we think of, civil war, mayhem. Yeah, but failed state can also be a state without institutions, without huge rates of violence. We didn't have massive violence in Ecuador, but nothing worked properly. The state wasn't defending the interests of its citizens. You had these kind of strong men running, often plantation owners, we're going back to the plantation state, running the country, but from a very localized agenda with no real nation-state project.
But after centuries of those who challenged the power of big capital being crushed, something finally changed. Leftist economist Rafael Correa was elected on a platform of rejecting the entire neoliberal order. The Correa government brought in a completely new constitution, which guaranteed rights for poor and working class people, and for the first time ever, for nature, an unthinkable concept in a world where capital overrides life.
He created a broad, modernizing coalition that goes probably from the center-left to the Communist Party. Including the biggest party in that coalition, which is Alianza País. In our National Assembly, the equivalent of our Congress, out of 137 seats, Alianza País holds 100 seats, so more than a 2/3 majority. In the last presidential elections in 2013, President Correa won with 57% of the popular vote in the first round of presidential elections. This is the biggest mandate in the history of Ecuador. And we achieved that in Ecuador through a constituent process, a constituent assembly that drafted a new constitution and drafted the new rules of the game of a new social contract, of a new social pact. This is really important because you can't really analyze the Chevron case and Ecuador's response to the Chevron case without looking at the new social contract.
After centuries of being bled dry by empires and elites, the biggest change was an assertion of national sovereignty. Ecuador kicked out the U.S. military base in Manta, raised taxes on banks and the super rich, and stood up to big oil, including Chevron Texaco.
Entonces, Chevron, con todo su poder económico, ha alargado el juicio. Compraba, es una empresa corrupta y corruptora. Hay varios testimonios de gente que fue presionada por Chevron. Uno de los testigos claves de Chevron para decir que el sistema de justicia ecuatoriano es corrupto. Es un juez corrupto que fue comprado por Chevron, lo tiene con su familia en Estados Unidos, pagándole un gran sueldo mensual o una gran subsistencia mensual. Entonces, con esas argucias demoró el juicio, hasta que vino nuestro gobierno. Fue el único al que no pudo comprar Chevron. En los demás gobiernos tenía gran influencia, y por eso dice que nosotros nos involucramos en el juicio. Es todo lo contrario. Por primera vez hay independencia en el juicio. Y como hubo independencia, se le dio la razón a quienes la tenían, los indígenas amazónicos. Porque usted puede ir a la Amazonía, cualquier televidente, norteamericano, cualquier persona puede venir a la Amazonía ecuatoriana, meter las manos en las lagunas de petróleo dejadas por Texaco hace ya más de 20 años, y saldrá esa mano negra de petróleo.
Clearly, Chevron wasn't expecting this kind of sovereign, government to come in 2007 and actually say, yeah, this is not right. Ecuadorian people have been victim of this behavior of a multinational without getting involved in the judicial proceedings at all, but saying it, because there's a historic and a political responsibility on behalf of any ruler to say, yes, my people have been affected by this company. And so there's been a major attempt and also a legal, juridical, international strategy to try and imply that there's been meddling on behalf of the Ecuadorian government in judicial proceedings.
In 2009, Chevron made its most drastic legal maneuver yet. It brought Ecuador to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. But don't be confused by the name. The Hague was simply being used as a venue. The court itself was a body created to settle investment disputes for the World Bank. Ecuador was forced to face Chevron in this court under the authority of a bilateral investment treaty signed between the U.S. and Ecuador.
Arbitration mechanisms do not operate in the interest of the majorities, do not operate in the interest of law, and are not fair at the end. And the case of Ecuador, I think, is very emblematic. Bilateral investment treaty is very important, but because it's a very strong tool. But it's incredible because the bilateral investment treaty with the U.S. entered into force in '97. But, Chevron ended its operation in Ecuador in '92. And now they're applying the bilateral investment treaty retroactively, and they're using that as a protection mechanism to say, yes, Ecuador is responsible. They did not respect the bilateral investment treaty with the U.S. Impossible to respect a treaty that didn't exist in '92. UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, they did a study on the arbitration mechanisms, and they have numbers that are shocking. Shocking in terms of saying that the same judges, because since there is not a court, a specific court, it's a group of judges that are in charge of the arbitration processes. It's the same group of 20 judges. They receive millions of dollars, and the whole system is corrupt.
Yeah.
And this is being proven by the UN itself. But,
right.
Countries do not stand up and say, we cannot accept that. Well, we cannot accept CIADI, we cannot accept the arbitration courts that are operating in that way. And they have a list of, I think, 20 judges that they are the same. It's a business that put, in risk the right to development of countries like Ecuador.
Estos tratados de protección recíproca de inversiones, con eso el capital tiene más derechos que los seres humanos. Si aquí un ciudadano se siente afectado por el Estado y quiere llevarnos a una Corte Internacional de Derechos Humanos, tiene que agotar primero todas las instancias jurídicas nacionales. Con estos tratados, una empresa privada ya puede llevar un Estado soberano sin ningún trámite a estos centros de arbitraje, donde todo está en función de la transnacional y del capital, porque los mismos árbitros no son de carrera, son árbitros ad hoc, normalmente abogados de estas compañías petroleras. El asunto es descarado.
Among many allegations at The Hague, Chevron declared that the Ecuadorian government should have prevented the lawsuit against Chevron in the first place, based on its sham remediation deal with President Mahmoud.
Dirá Texaco, Chevron Texaco dice que es nuestra empresa estatal, que después continuó operando, la que contaminó. Pregúntele a las comunidades allá, centenas, miles de personas, y le va a decir que nadie más operó ahí, solo Texaco. Ellos fueron los que contaminaron. Entonces, finalmente se le dio la razón a quienes la tenían, pero así es el poder económico. Esta gente se cree sobre los estados, se cree sobre la justicia. Pusieron una serie de incidentes legales, empezaron una campaña brutal de desprestigio contra nuestro gobierno, contrataron a empresas de relaciones públicas para decir que nuestro gobierno es corrupto, que nos involucramos en el juicio. Nos pusieron un juicio a nosotros en La Haya con estos tratados de protección recíproca de inversiones, argumentando que el Estado ya había firmado que se había limpiado todo, efectivamente en el 98, con corrupción. Malos funcionarios dijeron que todo se había limpiado, pero ahí está la realidad.
Yet the World Bank's private tribunal ruled in favor of Chevron. It ordered the Ecuadorian government to stop all efforts in the country to collect the $9.5 billion judgment against the oil company, and to prevent the plaintiffs from pursuing their cases in countries where Chevron is stashing its assets. In the end, the Ecuadorian state was forced to pay $112 million to Chevron by this small private World Bank court, which essentially gave itself the authority to override the decision of any court, of any sovereign nation. By contrast, there is no international court that wields the authority to make Chevron pay for human rights and environmental crimes. And this situation could soon be raised to a new level with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where the U.S., along with 11 other countries, are signing on to an agreement that will institute secret corporate courts just like this one, tasked with undermining laws of countries if their profits are impeded. Oil titans like Chevron are the beating heart of the U.S. empire, and they work hand in hand to keep that blood pumping. In the most blatant expression, Chevron Board of Directors member Condoleezza Rice resigned to dutifully serve as George W. Bush's national security advisor, helping cement the corporation's relationship with the oil-friendly Bush regime. Chevron won big from the criminal war in Iraq, becoming one of the first companies to be awarded contracts following the 2003 invasion. The corporation even became part of a special project to restructure Iraq's conquered economy, helping form the new Iraq oil law, which handed Iraq's once nationalized oil to corporations like Chevron. Today, Chevron is a multi-million-dollar sponsor to the Clinton Foundation. Its top-tier donations got the corporation extra perks from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, partnering to spread fracking to developing countries. And the U.S. war machine continues to do its part by ensuring the markets stay profitable. There continues to be far-reaching CIA operations to undermine the government of Ecuador and other leftist governments in Latin America. The American people pay over $24 million in tax dollars a year on these covert operations in Ecuador alone. This is the real context of Chevron versus the Amazon. It is the story being told around the globe of underdeveloped countries rising from the ashes of colonialism, neoliberalism, and subordination to empire, asserting their rights and national sovereignty. If Chevron is held accountable, it will send a message to the kings of this decaying social order that the people can unite, organize, and win. Only the defenders of the torrid past of corporate hegemony over human beings, enforced by war and terrorism, only they can deny that Chevron must pay what it owes to the people of the Amazon. But regardless of whether they pay or not, the truth about their terrible crimes have been exposed. A movement connected across the world, and a new tide against corporate impunity on the rise.